Hello, and welcome to Lecture 5 of the Race and Racism course. With me, John Beverly. Today I'm going to give you a brief summary of where we've been up until now, and then we'll jump into Baldwin on language, and then Baldwin on Faulkner and desegregation. Then, as I mentioned in previous discussions, we'll be shifting over into working on strategies for unearthing racism and implicit beliefs about it among interlocutors, and how to combat that and work against it, and hopefully change minds. We'll start with the summary here. Remember, discussed all of these things on the left hand side of your screen, and I'll just briefly give you examples and a little reminder of what they mean, because these are going to be useful tools for us when we're thinking about strategies going forward. There are explicit beliefs. Here's an example. The sun is a star. I'm sure you've all believed this at some point, even said it aloud. On the other hand, implicit beliefs. The sun could melt an iPad. I bet you all believe that. I bet it's something you would recognize as true, but you may, or very likely, I think, that you haven't thought about it before. On the other hand, there's ignorance. The sun's chemical composition is, for instance, this is surprisingly an unanswered question in physics. We know what it probably is, but nobody's really clear on what exactly the chemical composition is. So we are ignorant about that. There are false beliefs. The sun orbits the earth. Some people, of course, used to believe this is true. Or now it seems to be the other way around. Speech acts. We've discussed this in various forms. Speech acts, I would like at this point to distinguish, when I'm talking about speech acts, between the sort of thing that someone says, like for instance, the sun is a star, how they say it. I just said that as an assertion, for instance. The sun is a star. I've asserted that is true. That's what I mean here when I say performance. Performance can come in many forms. I could say the sun is a star, and now I have said the same content, right? The sun is a star, but I have said it as a question, and that is a different performance. And on the other hand, we can think about the effect. Like, what does it mean, or what happens, or what is the upshot of me asserting or asking or commanding things, right? When I assert the sun is a star, here's one effect. People usually they just take that as true. It's not like new information. It's not shocking. Now, on the other hand, if I asked if the sun was a star, the sun is a star, I say it like that, what's the effect? Well, people are probably going to be confused, right? Now, lastly here, we discussed responsibility, sort of an analysis of what it takes to be responsible in different circumstances. And as we discussed, I think very important to analyses of responsibility is to keep in mind the context of harm, aid, cost, rarity, and awareness. For instance, how costly is it to someone to donate blood plasma, right? Not very. How much harm or aid is there on the table, right? Is it very harmful to donate? No. Could you prevent a lot of harm? In some cases, yes. Could you provide a lot of aid? In some cases, yes. Are you rare in your ability to provide that aid or prevent that harm? Sometimes, yes. Are you aware of that? Sometimes, yes. If all of those are on the table, it seems like you have a strong responsibility to do the blood donation, right? Like John Harrison was the example. His blood can cure, or is used to construct a vaccine that can cure rhesus disease, saves millions of lives. Good thing he believes this is true, but certainly has a responsibility to do so. Now, if you've noticed, all of the examples I've used here are sterile in the sense that they do not involve charged examples that we will be discussing in class, or have discussed in class, about race and racism. I've done this on purpose so that you can see the structure of the concepts at play. On this neutral territory, or on these neutral topics, before we apply them and discuss them in the context of race, which can be very charged. So an explicit belief, an example of that when we're thinking about race, could be equality, right? Like everybody should be treated equally. This is what a lot of people seem to believe. Implicit belief, on the other hand, here's where we get some friction. This is you can read this off of behavior. I say on the one hand that, yes, everybody should be equal, and yet I act in such a way that undermines that. Namely, people who say that explicit statement about equality might nevertheless not hire individuals from marginalized groups to do tasks at the same rate as they would, say, a white person. Like, this is implicit and explicit beliefs in conflict, what were discussed as a performative contradiction. Ignorance, on the other hand, this is more or less somewhat rare, I think, when we're discussing like race issues in the U.S. at least, because we have so much information coming in all the time about the oppressive nature of our system and the oppressive individuals supporting it. It's hard to claim that there's too much ignorance about this, despite some people's best efforts. But still, the idea here would be, unaware or completely unaware of the plight of many people. Like a white individual might go for some part of their life, a reasonable part of their life, without being aware at all about the sort of difficulties that a black individual has to go through when they're living in the U.S. Like, it's not on their radar. They don't have to experience it. They don't have to deal with it. And so it's plausible in some cases they are ignorant, at least for a little bit. Now, false beliefs, on the other hand, these are obviously beliefs that are just straight up wrong, right? We see a lot of stereotype myths. People might people often do hold false beliefs about the intelligence of individuals in marginalized groups and should be undermined if they can be identified. Now, speech acts, we've seen this so far in the class, illustrated for us in various speeches, in various writings. Douglas, for instance, I put the point that he was engaged in irony. So he is saying one thing and doing something else with his words. That is, a conflict here between the content and the performance. The effect being, I think, an illustration of how he can be just as inconsistent, as a matter of fact, as any white person can. And lastly here, responsibility. We just got into this. The sort of responsibility analysis I have in mind here involves speakers like myself, white individuals who have a sort of authority when they speak. People listen to them, and being able to open up space for others where possible, being able to use that ability to direct attention where it needs to be, not to go around speaking all the time or like teaching classes all the time, right? But using the sort of pedestal that one has to create greater representation, more diversity where it's useful and needed. Now, I'm going to move on now to Baldwin on language. We'll discuss some of the details of Baldwin's life in class, but right now we're just going to focus on, as we usually do, some of the themes in the readings that we worked through this week. So here's a great way, I think, to start in on Baldwin's discussion of English and Black English. Think about what the purpose of language is. I think many people, even today, will be inclined to say it's about communicating. And closely associated with this, what's best when you're trying to communicate? Well, look, being honest. Like, you assert something, and you only assert things that are true, right? Like, you just be honest. Right? That's bread and butter of communication. Now, this is, I think, because people typically think that communicating is about conveying information from one person to another, through testimony is what we often call it. I say there's a squirrel outside my window. You assume I'm telling the truth. I've testified as such. I've asserted it's true. But look, this is very one-sided. It's pretty idealistic. Language is about communication, true, and communication about testimony, true, when interlocutors have the same goals and values. One commonly assumed set of goals and values is truth-telling. People typically think that like when you're going around asserting, for instance, asserting this or that you're doing it in the interest of telling the truth. And another is the presumption that speakers have roughly the same credibility when making testimony. These two assumptions are not often shared values and goals in conversation, nor should they be. Individuals from marginalized groups, for instance, have good reason to think privileged individuals will not give their testimony the appropriate credibility. Individuals from marginalized backgrounds often experience, in fact, credibility deficits. They say something, and it's not taken with the same air of credibility as it would be if they were a privileged speaker. As I've said a couple of times, when I speak, people listen, even if I'm making stuff up. I get a credibility excess, but The world is full of examples, and I'm pulling this one here from philosophers who at conferences will often share solutions to some problem or some criticism of a talk, and everybody will ignore them until just a bit later when one of the men says the same thing, and everybody's like, oh, how brilliant, how smart. Like, this is not uncommon, and philosophers are trying, and it happens all the same. Credibility deficits happen a lot. Credibility excess is just as important. Examples like this undermine the common assumption that communication involves roughly equally credible testifiers because there are deficits and excesses. But this, as it stands, this doesn't obviously undermine the assumption that communication is about conveying truth, of course. But Baldwin does, I think, in this, as to have truth in his sights. Because that assumption is undermined when you're noting social, economic, moral, and political harms often arise in tandem with credibility deficits. Such harms, these harms, support the use of communication as deceptive, to conceal and to protect, because you can't trust your interlocutor, right? Trust is not on the table, and because of this deficits and the social and economic, moral, and political harms associated with it, so like the history right here, like you can see it unfold as a speaker, right? Like, why would you trust? Why would you want to just tell a group of white people everything honestly and openly? Why wouldn't you want to conceal? What do you owe them, right? They've done nothing but hurt you. I think these sort of observations go somewhat to explain why, for instance, black women are much less likely to report domestic abuse, because in part they are protecting the community. They're not wanting to feed into existing stereotypes of black men as abusive. And on the other hand, they don't trust cops, right? Like, why would you want to bring a cop into your house? Why would you want to be honest in that respect and rely on systems that have, again, been historically associated with social, economic, moral, and political harms right alongside this credibility deficits? Now, upshot here, and what Baldwin is getting at, I believe, is that language is not simply about communicating truths. It doesn't simply involve individuals viewed as equally credible. And since these harms are associated with credibility deficits, those experiencing them in conversational context perhaps should, and I think they should, undermine norms of truth when communicating in a lot of cases. Now, Faulkner was anti-slavery but pro-states' rights. He claimed Southern states were morally wrong for mistreatment of black individuals, but he also claimed the federal government was morally wrong for intervening in how states governed themselves. He suggested that if the federal government just saves Southerners time to get over the loss of the Civil War, they'd eventually choose to grant political and civil rights to black individuals without the need for force. This seems straightforwardly inconsistent, right? It does. Like, he's saying, roughly speaking, I know it's wrong, but let us be wrong for a little bit. We'll figure it out. Now, Baldwin isn't willing to just let Faulkner off so easily, and by this I just mean he's not willing to just say Faulkner's stupid, Faulkner's inconsistent. He doesn't think Faulkner sees the inconsistency. Typically, when people realize they have inconsistent beliefs, they change them. As an example, David Lewis famously once believed that North Street and West Street ran roughly parallel to Acorn Street until he realized that they both couldn't be true, and he had to take something back. Typically, we pull back inconsistent beliefs, or we change them if we realize we have something like that in our belief set. Faulkner, Baldwin is suggesting, as it seemed to put his belief that states' rights trump human rights with his belief that everyone should be treated equally, and these seem to be very much in conflict. And Baldwin urges that what Faulkner lacks, though, is integrity. It's a willingness to explore one's beliefs and to seek out inconsistencies like this and to be honest with oneself. Integrity is increasingly important when its absence harms people, as it so clearly does here. And Faulkner's lack of integrity, which is a moral failing, leads to his ignorance, an epistemic failing, of an inconsistent belief, or set of them, that leads to harmful behavior, which is, of course, another moral failing. Now, Baldwin, he wants to think about why, too. Now, he doesn't go into much detail about this, but here's where I'm going to add some stuff. Why is it that Faulkner is in this sort of situation? I think Faulkner was unwilling to see that his explicit beliefs were in tension with his implicit beliefs, in part due to shame. And we're going to discuss this in class a lot more, but I want just to prime you to think about this. Consider, what do you think intuitively the difference is between shame and guilt? And I think this will give us at least two ways to think about Baldwin's analysis, or at least Faulkner's mental state. And this in turn will give us targets when we're thinking about strategies, when we're engaged in discussion or conversation, or, advertising to people like Faulkner. Speaking of which, strategies. Let's discuss some. Now, we'll start here. Imagining versus supposing. Imagining is often affective. It has emotional quality to it. If you imagine something terrifying or terrible, you usually have some feelings associated with that imagining. Supposing is sterile. It's not like that. You can imagine somebody being tortured, like really imagine it. You might feel that. You might feel something like it. You feel pain or fear or something. But supposing it happens, less so. Why is that? It's not clear. It might have something to do with the fact that supposing is always directed or voluntary and directed at things. When you suppose something, you do it for the sake of something else. Imagining, not so directed, you can do it at any point for any reason. You don't have to direct yourself elsewhere once you've imagined something. Now, the reason I bring this up now is because if you're talking to somebody who is espousing either explicitly or implicitly, I think that the best case here would be implicitly expressing some racist positions, asking them or just leaving it up to them to imagine that they might be wrong is bound to bring up with them a lot of emotional response. Shame, for instance, guilt. Now, on the other hand, if you direct them intentionally to suppose that what they're saying is wrong, that is sterile, and you'll get them to focus more on the consequences of being wrong rather than them being wrong. And that, I found, in my experience, a much more effective way to broach conversation about difficult topics. So we're going to practice shifting guiding people to imagining things, which they do by default, I believe, and to supposing things are true, especially tough things to deal with. On the other hand, appealing to or undermining universals. The sort of examples here, we've discussed this a couple of times, but it's always good to revisit. Locke's symbolism. Relating to other people who do not understand you. Locke suggested one way to do this was through art and abstract symbolism, showing commonalities between groups. I think this can be done well. Now, Black Lives Matter. This is universal in the sense that it's universalizing over a specific group and highlighting the importance of focusing on that group. Now, this is also appealing to universals. I think this goes well. This is exactly what should be done because historically these things have been overlooked. All lives matter. Here's where it goes wrong, right? And here's a target for undermining. When people say this, a charitable way to understand what they're saying is they're trying to bridge, common gap, like a common understanding. Privileged individuals, right? They're like, no, all lives matter. Don't you see? All lives matter. Well, of course we see. Of course. We're talking about emphasis here. And both things can be true is the important part. Now, again, I think charitably speaking, using these appeal to universals is a way that people, like in conversation, it's a tactic people will deploy to create a common ground so they have something on which they can build the rest of the conversation. I think in some cases that goes well. Locke symbolism, Black Lives Matter. Other cases can be used disastrously, like all lives matter, or saying something like, aren't we all just humans? Also bad, because universalizing in this way overlooks what's important. Even if we grant that it might be done charitably in some cases as a way to bridge conversational gaps, still. Now, targeting implicit beliefs with performance. We've seen this in some of the speeches, and I discussed it a moment ago too, but like asking rhetorical questions, sharply rhetorical questions that are obviously true, sarcasm, important. This is a great way to target implicit beliefs by performance. You're asking a question that obviously has an answer, right? And everybody knows what the answer is. Why would you be asking it if everybody already knows the answer, right? There has to be something else going on. That's the performance. It's Douglas, I can be as inconsistent as you are, right? Is the irony in his speech. What to the slave is the 4th of July. and battlefield valor, right? That, as I mentioned, worried some Confederate generals, insofar as it might undermine implicit beliefs that soldiers had about enslaved at the time individuals. Similarly, peaceful protests. MLK here peacefully protesting during a busy hour, economically speaking, in certain towns or cities, and then turning the other cheek, as it were, while the white business owners and others in the area were violently responding to these protests. Like, it's supposed to illustrate dignity. It's supposed to illustrate that, the moral high ground is with the individual being struck, not striking back, undermining in turn implicit beliefs about who has the better character in this scenario. Now, are just a few of the strategies we'll be discussing as we move forward, but this will be a good place, I think, to start. See you soon.